I came home to a backyard that didn't exist anymore. Every tree my father ever planted was gone. The HOA president said she had every right. I didn't yell. I just nodded. 6 months later, she opened an envelope worth $214,000. She laughed at first until she read the second page. What she didn't know about those trees would ruin her. My name is Mark Delaney, 44 years old, a structural engineer who moved back to Cedar Hollow Estates in Ohio after my father passed. I inherited his house, his tools, and the 2-acre lot behind it, where he'd spent 30 years growing a stand of black walnut and white oak trees he called the boys. I live there now with my wife Sarah and our daughter Emma, who's 10. We're not fancy people. We grill on weekends. We wave at neighbors. And until last spring, I believed an HOA was just a group that mowed the common areas and argued about mailbox colors. Cedar Hollow had 112 homes, a clubhouse nobody used, and a homeowners association run like a small kingdom. Deborah Kessler, everyone called her Debbie, had been HOA president for 9 years. She wasn't elected so much as she was never opposed, because opposing her had a way of becoming expensive. Debbie drove a white Lexus with a president parking placard she'd made herself for the clubhouse lot, which technically had no assigned spaces. She wore blazers to walk her dog. Neighbors joked that she measured grass height with a ruler. Nobody laughed too loud. In case she was listening, my father, Walter Delaney, planted those trees the year I was born. Black walnut takes decades to mature into anything valuable, and he used to say he was planting money for grandchildren he might never meet. He never mentioned the trees to the HOA, because when he planted them, there was no HOA yet. Cedar Hollow incorporated its association 11 years after my father broke ground on that grove. When the covenants were written, an attorney grandfathered in existing structures and landscaping older than the association itself. My father's trees were older than Debbie's presidency by nearly 2 decades. Protected before protection was even a word anyone used. I didn't know any of that when I moved in. I just knew the trees, the way you know a person's face. The walnut in the far corner had a rope swing scar on its lowest branch. The 3 oaks along the property line threw shade across Emma's swing set every summer afternoon. Debbie's first visit came 2 weeks after we moved in, clipboard in hand, informing us the grass was borderline and the mailbox post needed restaining within 30 days. I thanked her, restained it that weekend, and thought that was the end of it. It was, in fact, only the introduction. At the next quarterly meeting, I learned Debbie ran the Architectural Review Committee, the Landscaping Committee, and the Compliance Committee simultaneously, with 2 rotating members who rarely showed up. Any decision Debbie wanted made, she made herself, then presented as a unanimous board vote in the minutes afterward. A neighbor named Priya warned me quietly in the parking lot. She fined the Hendersons $4,000 over a shed inspection they never scheduled, she said. They moved out within the year. I filed it away as neighborhood gossip. I had bigger things on my mind, like Emma starting a new school. The trees came up for the first time at a June meeting, buried in new business. Debbie mentioned canopy encroachment concerns near the Delaney property, said it vaguely, glanced at me once, and moved on before I could ask a question. I didn't think much of it. I should have. What I didn't know was that Debbie had recently launched a side business, Kessler Reclaimed, selling authentic salvaged hardwood furniture through a boutique website. Her son Tyler ran a small landscaping and tree removal outfit. Old-growth black walnut, turns out, sells for staggering prices to furniture makers who prize its grain. I found this out much later, but the timing matters. Kessler Reclaimed launched 4 months before Debbie first mentioned canopy encroachment at that June meeting. Her son's tree service had exactly 1 active residential contract that quarter. Neither fact seemed connected to anything. On the surface, in June, my father's walnut grove, appraised decades earlier for insurance purposes at a modest sum, had matured into something else entirely. Veneer-grade black walnut this old, this straight-grained, this disease-free, was worth a fortune to the right buyer. Debbie, turned out, already knew exactly who that buyer was. I want to be clear about who I was before any of this happened. I wasn't a fighter. Paid HOA dues on time. Brought casseroles to new neighbors. I believed, the way a lot of decent people believe, that reasonable behavior gets met with reasonable behavior. That belief cost me. Sarah noticed Debbie's car slowing near our property line more than once that summer. Idling at the curb. Debbie's phone raised like she was taking photos. When I mentioned it at a barbecue, another neighbor said Debbie photographed everyone's yard. Everyone believed that. Everyone was wrong about what those photos were actually for. By late July, the canopy encroachment concerns became a certified letter. It cited Section 7.2 of the covenants, claimed my trees violated a view corridor easement I'd never heard of, and demanded I trim the canopy by 40% within 14 days or face daily fines starting at $200. I called the HOA office. The woman who answered, Debbie's part-time assistant, said Debbie wasn't available and the letter speaks for itself. I asked to see the view corridor easement referenced in Section 7.2. She said I'd need to submit a formal records request. In writing, with a processing fee. I paid the fee. 30 days. What came back was a single page. An internal memo dated only 6 weeks earlier, describing a board-approved sightline policy for corner lots. My lot wasn't a corner lot. The memo didn't even reference my address. I photographed every page. At the August meeting, I stood up during public comment and asked, politely, for the board vote record approving this sightline policy. Debbie said the vote happened in executive session, which wasn't required to be minuted. Another board member, a quiet man named Frank, glanced at his hands and said nothing. Sarah wanted to hire a lawyer immediately. I told her that felt like overkill for a tree trimming dispute. Looking back, that instinct to de-escalate, to assume good faith, was exactly the instinct Debbie counted on. She'd built 9 years of unopposed power on the backs of people who didn't want to make a scene. I trimmed the canopy myself that weekend, generously, more than the letter even required, just to close the matter. I sent photos to the HOA office as proof of compliance. 3 days later, a new letter arrived. The fine wasn't dropped. It had, somehow, already accrued to $1,100. The letter cited a new violation, root system destabilization risk, to the shared drainage easement running behind 6 properties, including mine. This was the first time roots, rather than canopy, were mentioned. I asked a certified arborist, on my own dime, to inspect the grove. He found nothing wrong. The arborist's written report stated the walnut and oak root systems were healthy, appropriately distanced from the drainage line, and posed no structural risk whatsoever. I submitted this report to the HOA. Debbie's response, forwarded through her assistant, was one sentence: "The board maintains its independent assessment of risk." I started keeping a folder. Every letter, every email, every date and timestamp. Sarah called it my Debbie folder and joked I was building a case file like a detective show. I laughed along with her. Neither of us realized yet how literally that folder would end up being used. Tyler Kessler's truck. Delaney and Sons Tree Service stenciled nowhere on it but Kessler Landscaping instead. Appeared twice that August, parked at the curb near my property. Engine idling. Tyler taking measurements with a laser rangefinder aimed straight at my walnut trees. I asked him what he was doing. He said, "Just looking." At a neighborhood coffee gathering, Priya mentioned that her cousin worked at a hardwood mill 2 counties over. Her cousin had mentioned, offhand, that a small local outfit had recently been trying to sell an unusually large quantity of mature black walnut logs. No paperwork of origin. Cash preferred. Nobody connected it to me. Yet, the fines kept accruing on paper even after I complied with every written demand. By September, the HOA claimed I owed $1,900. I paid it under protest, in writing, specifically to avoid a lien on my house, which Debbie had mentioned twice now in increasingly casual, increasingly threatening tones. Frank, the quiet board member, cornered me in the clubhouse parking lot one evening. He looked over his shoulder before speaking. "I've seen this before," he said. "Not with trees. With a driveway. It always ends the same way for the other family. Get a lawyer. Mark. A real one." I finally listened. Renata Cho, who specialized in HOA disputes and had, turned out, a folder of her own on Cedar Hollows Association after representing the Hendersons 2 years earlier in a dispute that ended, quietly, in a settlement neither party could discuss publicly. Renata's first move was simple. She requested, formally, all board meeting minutes for the past 2 years, all executive session logs, and the original recorded covenants with every amendment timestamped. Associations are legally required to produce this. Debbie's office took the maximum legal window to respond, then sent half of it. What we did receive was revealing. The view corridor policy Debbie cited didn't exist in any minutes prior to June. It had been inserted retroactively into an amended document. The metadata on the digital file showing a creation date only 4 days before my very first violation letter arrived. It was fabricated. Renata explained this calmly over the phone, the way lawyers explain things that are actually enormous. They wrote the rule to fit the violation, she said, instead of the other way around. That's not just bad governance, Mark. Depending on what happens next, that could be fraud. I didn't sleep well after that call. Not from fear exactly, more from the strange vertigo of realizing the ground I'd been standing on. Reasonable neighbor, reasonable dispute, had never been solid. Debbie hadn't been enforcing rules. She'd been building a case against my trees from the very beginning. Sarah asked the question that mattered most. Why our trees? Or the dead pine 3 doors down that's an actual hazard. I didn't have an answer yet, Renata did. It's different from everyone else's, she told me. That's your motive. I called the arborist back and asked him a different question this time. Not are they safe, but are they valuable? He hesitated, then said something that changed everything. Mark, I don't usually say this, but those walnuts are some of the finest veneer-grade timber I've seen on a residential lot in 20 years. He explained further. Branch-free trunks that tall, that wide, that old, free of disease and metal contamination, could fetch anywhere from $6,000 to $15,000 per tree from specialty mills, sometimes more at auction for the best logs. I had 11 mature walnuts. The math landed like a slap. I sat with that number for a long time before telling Sarah. Somewhere between shock and clarity, I felt something shift in me, quiet and cold, the specific feeling of realizing you've been played by someone who assumed you'd never do the arithmetic. Debbie had assumed exactly that. She was about to learn otherwise. The HOA sent a third letter in late September, this one different in tone. It offered a compliance resolution the association would arrange, at its own expense, professional removal of hazardous root-compromised limbs, conducted by a vetted, licensed local contractor. No contractor was named. I already knew who it would be. Renata advised me to respond in writing, requesting the contractor's name, license number, insurance certificate, and a formal scope of work before any access to my property was granted. This is standard, reasonable, and legally required. Debbie's office never answered the request. Instead, silence for 3 full weeks. The silence was the trap. October came, and with it, a work trip I couldn't avoid. A 5-day engineering conference in Denver I'd committed to a year prior. Sarah and Emma stayed with Sarah's sister 2 towns over for a planned visit during the same window. Our house sat empty for 5 days. Debbie knew our calendar. How did she know our calendar? Later, this became one of the ugliest discoveries in the entire ordeal. The HOA's clubhouse rental system, which Debbie personally administered, logged Sarah's sister's address as an emergency contact on a form filed months earlier for a community event. Debbie had access to everything. I left for Denver on a Tuesday morning, kissed Sarah and Emma goodbye, and told them I'd call every night. I had no idea that within 72 hours, everything my father had planted, 30 years of growth, 30 years of shade, 30 years of memory, would be reduced to stumps and sawdust. Tyler Kessler's crew arrived Wednesday at 7 a.m., according to a neighbor's doorbell camera footage we later obtained. 3 trucks, 2 chainsaw teams, and a rented crane for the largest trunks. They worked with the practiced speed of men who had done this exact job many times before, on many other properties. The neighbor, an early riser named Dolores, assumed it was an HOA-approved job, since Tyler's truck displayed a laminated placard reading, "Authorized Cedar Hollow HOA Contractor," zip-tied to the dashboard. Nobody questioned trucks with that placard. That was, of course, exactly the point of printing it. By Wednesday afternoon, all 11 walnut trees and both boundary oaks were gone. Not trimmed. Felled at the base, limbed on site, and the trunks loaded whole onto a flatbed that left Cedar Hollow by 4 p.m. and was never seen in the neighborhood again. 30 years. Gone in 9 hours. Dolores called me that evening, apologetic, assuming I already knew, asking if the HOA tree project had gone the way I wanted. I stood in a Denver hotel room in stunned silence for what felt like a full minute before I could ask her, carefully, to describe exactly what she'd seen. I booked the first flight home. Sarah, still at her sister's, drove back separately, arriving before me. She called me from our backyard, her voice flat with disbelief, describing a landscape of raw stumps and churned earth where a forest had stood 2 days earlier. Emma's swing set now sat in full, shadeless sun. I landed at midnight and drove straight from the airport without stopping. Standing in that backyard under a phone flashlight, counting 11 walnut stumps and 2 oak stumps, I felt something I'd never felt before in my life. A grief specific enough to have no name, tangled up with something sharper underneath it. My father built a treehouse ladder into the second walnut when I was 7. The rungs, weathered gray, still hung from a stump now 3 feet tall, nailed to nothing, leading nowhere. I sat down in the wet grass at 1 a.m. and, for the first time since his funeral, I cried. The first call I made the next morning wasn't to Debbie. It was to Renata. Her language about hazardous root-compromised limbs. Then described 11 full trees felled at the base and hauled away by flatbed. That's not limb removal, she said quietly. That's a total, unauthorized clear-cut. Renata explained the legal landscape in blunt terms. No board vote existed authorizing full removal. Only vague language about hazardous limbs. No license permit had been pulled with the county for tree removal of this scale, which Ohio law required for lots over a certain canopy percentage. No notice of entry had been given. I filed a police report that same afternoon for criminal damage to property. The responding officer photographed the stumps, the tire ruts, and the drag marks across the lawn. He told me, off the record, that this was the second HOA-related destruction complaint he'd personally responded to in Cedar Hollow in 3 years. I called Debbie's office demanding an explanation. Her assistant transferred me directly to Debbie for the first time in months. Her voice was calm, almost bored. The board authorized necessary hazard mitigation, she said. You were notified in writing multiple times. I'm sorry you're upset, but the trees were a liability. I asked her to send me the specific board resolution authorizing complete removal, with a vote date and signatures. She said it would take some time to locate in our records. I already knew, from the pattern of the past 4 months, exactly what that meant. It meant it didn't exist yet. That evening, I did something I'd never expected to do. I contacted the mill 2 counties over that Priya's cousin had mentioned back in August. The one that had been offered mature black walnut logs with no paperwork. I asked, carefully, whether they'd received a delivery from a seller matching Tyler Kessler's description. The mill's purchasing manager, a cautious man named Russ, wouldn't confirm specifics over the phone, citing customer confidentiality, but he did say something useful. We turned away a load like that Wednesday, he said. No chain of custody paperwork. We don't touch timber we can't trace. Try the mill in Zanesville. I called the Zanesville mill the next morning. This time, I didn't ask questions directly. I simply asked whether they'd purchased black walnut logs that week, and if so, whether they'd be willing to speak with an appraiser about fair market value for insurance purposes. The manager, unaware of the stakes. Agreed easily. Renata sent a formal appraiser, one accredited for timber litigation, to the Zanesville mill with a subpoena-adjacent records request, since we now had an active police report supporting the inquiry. What came back 3 days later was the second gut punch of the ordeal, though this one landed very differently than the first. The mill had purchased 11 black walnut trunks and 2 white oak trunks the previous Wednesday. Cash transaction. Seller listed as T. Kessler. Kessler Landscaping LLC. Total sale price $41,600. The invoice existed. The signature existed. The paper trail Debbie assumed would never surface existed in full. I stared at that invoice for a long time. $41,000. My father's trees, sold for cash within 24 hours of being cut down. On my property, without my knowledge, without a permit, without a vote. And somewhere in that number was the real reason for the fake sightline policy in June. Renata's tone shifted from cautious to focused. This isn't just an HOA overreach anymore, she said. This is theft. Depending on what your county prosecutor decides, this could be criminal, not just civil. Mark, I think we stopped playing defense entirely. I agreed without hesitation. We requested a full forensic accounting of Kessler Landscaping's contracts with Cedar Hollow HOA for the past 3 years. What came back? After a formal records request Debbie's office couldn't legally deny given the active police investigation, showed Tyler's company had removed hazardous trees from 4 other properties in that span. Every single one of those 4 properties belonged to families who had, according to public records Renata pulled, sold their homes and moved away within 18 months of the hazard mitigation work. Every single removal had been authorized through the same pattern: a retroactively dated policy memo, a compliance letter, and silence. I reached out to 2 of those former neighbors, tracked down through mutual contacts. Both, cautiously, confirmed the same story. Mature, valuable trees. A sudden HOA safety concern. A crew that arrived while they were away or distracted. A fight nobody won, ending in exhaustion and a for sale sign. One of them, a woman named Carla who'd owned 3 mature sugar maples prized by furniture makers for their curly grain, told me she'd never even considered that her trees might have been the target, not the excuse. I thought it was about control, she said. I never thought it was about money. That reframing changed how I understood everything. Debbie's reputation as a controlling, rule-obsessed HOA president wasn't incidental to the scheme. It was the perfect cover for it. Nobody questions a control freak for enforcing a nitpicky rule. Everybody assumes it's about power, ego, small-mindedness. Nobody assumes it's a business model. Renata and I built a timeline stretching back 3 years, cross-referencing Kessler Reclaim's product launches, Tyler's contract dates, the appraised timber values of each targeted property, and the retroactively created HOA policies used to justify each removal. Laid out on a single page, the pattern was no longer deniable. It was a system. I still hadn't decided what to do with this information. Sue the HOA. Press criminal charges. Risks and timelines. All measured in months. Sometimes years. I wanted something faster. Something that would force this into the open before Debbie could destroy any more evidence. That night, sitting at my kitchen table staring at the mill invoice, $41,600, an idea started forming that had nothing to do with lawsuits at first. If Debbie's crew had sold my father's timber like a commercial harvest, then commercially, that's exactly what had happened. I decided to bill it as one. I called a second appraiser the next morning. This one specializing in landscape and heritage tree valuation rather than raw timber sale price, the kind used in insurance claims and legal damages, which accounts not just for lumber value but replacement cost, aesthetic loss, and, in cases of old growth, irreplaceability premiums. The appraiser walked the property with me for 3 hours, photographing stumps, measuring diameters, cross-referencing growth rings visible in the cut faces against historical rainfall data to confirm the tree's true age. 11 walnuts, average 62 years old. 2 oaks, closer to 80. This wasn't landscaping. This was an inherited forest. His written report arrived 4 days later. Using standard trunk formula method valuation for heritage hardwoods in Ohio, replacement and loss value for the 13 trees totaled $214,000. Not the $41,000 Debbie's son had pocketed from the mill. $214,000. I read it 3 times. For a while, after receiving that number, everything went strangely quiet. Renata was building the legal case methodically, gathering affidavits from Carla and the other families, formalizing the police report into a referral for the county prosecutor's office. I went back to work. Life resumed its ordinary shape. Debbie, for her part, seemed to sense nothing. She sent one more letter in late October, almost cheerful in tone, informing me the hazard mitigation matter was now closed and thanking me for my cooperation and patience during this process. I saved it. It would become, later, one of my favorite pieces of evidence. Sarah and I debated whether to warn Debbie in advance. Give her a chance to make things right quietly. Avoid a public spectacle. Renata was firm on this point. People like this don't respond to quiet chances, she said. They respond to consequences they can't spin. Give her an opening, and she'll use it. I spent those weeks learning things about invoicing, damages, and demand letters I never expected to learn as an engineer. Renata explained that a formal, professionally documented invoice, backed by an accredited appraisal, sent as a legal demand before any lawsuit, often forces a response lawyers can't ignore, even when opposing parties want to. We drafted the invoice carefully. Not a rant. A clean, itemized, professional document, 13 line items, 1 per tree, species, age, diameter, replacement value, total due, payment terms, 30 days, followed by a single sentence noting that failure to respond would result in immediate legal action for damages. Renata suggested sending it not to Debbie personally at first, but to the HOA's registered agent and its insurance carrier simultaneously, a move designed to trigger something Debbie clearly hadn't anticipated. Her own association's liability insurer opening an internal investigation into whether the HOA, not just Tyler's company, bore responsibility. We sent it on a Thursday in early November. Certified mail. 3 copies. 1 to Debbie as HOA president. 1 to the HOA's registered agent. One to the association's general liability carrier, flagged as a formal notice of claim. Then we waited, the way you wait after finally pulling a pin. The first response came fastest, and from the party we least expected, the insurance carrier. Within 5 business days, an adjuster called Renata's office requesting the full timeline, the appraisal, and, notably, asking whether the HOA board had been informed the removal was conducted without a permitted contractor or board authorization vote. That question told us something important. The carrier suspected, correctly, that Debbie may have acted outside board authority entirely, which would mean the HOA's insurance might not cover the claim at all, leaving Debbie personally, not the association, financially exposed for the full amount. She had built her scheme to hide behind the HOA. It wasn't going to hide her. Debbie's response came 6 days after the invoice. Not from her, but from an attorney, a man named Gary Pruitt who specialized, according to his website, in small business and community association defense.
His letter called our claim grossly inflated and an attempt to intimidate.
Renata's reply letter was 2 pages, calm, surgical, and included 4 things Gary Pruitt clearly hadn't been told about. The mill invoice showing Tyler Kessler's cash sale, the fabricated policy metadata, Carla's affidavit describing an identical pattern, and the police report already referred to the county prosecutor's office for review. 2 weeks of silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, Frank, the quiet board member, called me directly, off the record, his voice shaking slightly. "I need to tell you something," he said, "but I need you to understand I'm risking a lot by calling you. Can we meet somewhere that isn't the clubhouse?" We met at a diner 2 towns over. Frank brought a manila folder of his own. Printed emails he'd quietly saved over the past 2 years, showing Debbie instructing board members to approve landscaping expenditures informally without full votes, and 1 email, damningly, referencing moving the Walnut situation before Q4 numbers close. Q4 numbers, Frank explained, referred to Kessler Reclaim's fiscal year. Debbie needed inventory before her end-of-year sales push for a furniture line she'd been advertising as Heritage American Hardwood. Sustainably reclaimed. Reclaimed, turned out, meant something very different from what her customers assumed it meant. Frank agreed to provide a sworn statement. He'd stayed silent for years. He admitted, partly from fear of Debbie's retaliation, partly, he confessed with visible shame, because he'd assumed the families targeted before mine had simply been unlucky or overreacting. My case, he said, was the one he could no longer rationalize away. With Frank's statement, Renata's case moved from strong to nearly airtight. We now had the fabricated policy document, the mill sale invoice, a whistleblower board member's sworn testimony, 2 prior victims' affidavits, and an insurance carrier already leaning toward denying coverage due to unauthorized action outside board process. Debbie, unaware of Frank's defection, escalated instead of retreating. In late November, a lien notice appeared, filed against my property by the HOA for unpaid architectural review and compliance fees, totaling $3,400, the very fines I'd already paid under protest months earlier. She was doubling down. Renata called this move a mistake born of panic. filing a fraudulent lien against a property whose owner was actively pursuing a documented damages claim against the association was, she explained, not just aggressive, it was reckless. It gave us grounds to pursue a slander of title claim on top of everything else. I received a call around this time from a local news producer. Carla, turned out, had grown tired of staying quiet too, and had reached out to a consumer investigations reporter at the regional news station about a pattern of aggressive HOA tree removals she'd noticed affecting several families across 2 counties. I hadn't planned on media involvement. Renata was cautious about it, warning that press attention could complicate settlement negotiations or spook Debbie into destroying more evidence before we could subpoena it. But Carla's instinct, turned out, was sharper than either of us gave her credit for. The story was already too big to stay quiet. The reporter, a woman named Josephine Reyes, had done her homework before ever calling me. She'd already pulled county records on Kessler Landscaping's business filings, cross-referenced them with Kessler, Reclaim's product photography, and noticed something Renata and I hadn't. Several reclaimed furniture listings used timber grain patterns matching black walnut. Not the reclaimed barn would advertised. Josephine asked if I'd go on camera. I said I needed to think about it. What tipped me toward yes wasn't anger. It was Emma, who'd started asking why our backyard looked sad now, why the swing set sat in full sun, why the treehouse ladder led to nothing. I wanted her to see this resolved, not buried. Debbie, meanwhile, seemed to sense the ground shifting without knowing exactly why. She called an emergency board meeting in early December, closed to homeowners, citing sensitive legal matters. Frank attended and later described her demeanor as unusually rattled, pushing hard for the board to formally ratify, after the fact, the original tree removal decision. 2 board members, previously rubber stamps, balked this time. One asked directly whether legal counsel had reviewed potential personal liability exposure for board members who ratified an action already under police investigation. Debbie, according to Frank, snapped at her, an outburst so uncharacteristic that even her longtime allies exchanged uneasy glances. That outburst became the second crack in her carefully maintained image. For 9 years, Debbie's power rested on projecting total control, total composure, total certainty that rules bent for her and only her. A room full of people watching her lose that composure, even briefly, planted a seed of doubt that would grow fast. Tyler Kessler, meanwhile, made his own mistake. Contacted by Josephine for comment, he denied everything initially, then, flustered, admitted the removal followed all proper HOA procedures, without realizing he'd just confirmed, on the record, that his company performed the job under HOA authorization, directly contradicting Debbie's earlier claim it had been necessary hazard mitigation, outside any formal contract. Renata seized on that contradiction immediately. If Tyler's company acted under HOA authorization, as he'd stated to a reporter, then the HOA bore direct organizational liability for the unauthorized, unpermitted removal, not just Debbie personally. If it hadn't been authorized, as Debbie herself had claimed, then Tyler had trespassed and stolen timber outright. Either answer incriminated someone. Both answers, together, incriminated everyone. December brought the first settlement overture from Gary Pruitt, offering $41,000, matching almost insultingly, the exact figure Tyler had received from the mill, as though returning stolen proceeds erased the underlying crime. Renata declined without even consulting me first, later joking it was the fastest no she'd ever sent an opposing counsel. I asked her why 41,000 felt so wrong to reject. Beyond the obvious math. Because it treats your father's trees like commodities they stole and are now returning the resale value of, she said. It ignores everything else. The fraud. The pattern against other families. The fear they built this neighborhood on for 9 years. We countered at 214,000. The full appraised value, plus legal fees, plus removal of the fraudulent lien, plus a formal written retraction and correction to the association's records acknowledging the removal was unauthorized. Gary Pruitt's response took 2 weeks this time, noticeably longer than before. Something on their end had shifted. What had shifted, we later learned, was the insurance carrier's formal coverage decision. After reviewing Frank's sworn statement and the fabricated policy metadata, the carrier officially denied HOA coverage for the claim, ruling the removal fell outside board-authorized action and therefore outside the policy's scope entirely. Debbie was now facing this alone. Personally, financially exposed. Gary Pruitt, according to Renata's read of his tone in their next call, seemed less like an aggressive defender now and more like a man managing a client rapidly running out of options. He requested a settlement conference. Renata agreed, on the condition that Debbie attend in person, not merely by phone through counsel. Debbie's insistence on control, ironically, made this condition easy for her ego to accept. She'd never once, in 9 years, allowed herself to appear absent from a confrontation in her own neighborhood. Renata later admitted she'd counted on exactly that instinct. Debbie couldn't resist showing up, even to a fight she was losing. The settlement conference was scheduled for the second week of January. At Renata's office, a neutral location chosen specifically because it wasn't the clubhouse, wasn't Debbie's territory, wasn't a room where her placard and her voice carried the same authority they'd carried for 9 unchallenged years. That, too, was intentional. In the days before the conference, I walked the backyard often, alone, in the cold. 13 stumps, snow dusting their cut faces. I found myself talking to them sometimes, quietly, the way you talk to something you missed. My father built this. A crane and a cash sale erased it in 9 hours. Sarah found me out there one evening and didn't say anything for a while. Just stood beside me. Whatever happens in that meeting, she finally said, these trees don't come back. I need you to know that going in, so the number doesn't feel like the point. She was right. The number was never the point. Renata prepared me carefully for the conference, walking through every document, every timeline, every worst-case pushback Gary Pruitt might attempt. Debbie built 9 years of power on people backing down, she said. The moment she realizes you're not backing down, and you have the paper trail to prove it, her whole strategy collapses. Watch her face when that happens. The morning of the settlement conference, Josephine Reyes called to say her investigative segment was finished, fact-checked, legal reviewed, and scheduled to air the following Monday regardless of the settlement outcome, since it now covered the broader pattern across 4 families, not just mine. Debbie's world, I realized, was about to become very public no matter what happened in that room. I hadn't told Renata about the news segment's air date beforehand, and when Gary Pruitt's assistant, in an unguarded moment before the meeting formally started, mentioned they'd seen a producer sniffing around Kessler Landscaping's Yelp page, I understood something crucial. They already knew what Monday would bring. Debbie arrived at the settlement conference 11 minutes late, wearing the same style of blazer she wore to walk her dog. Her composure visibly rehearsed. A woman determined to project the same unshakable control she'd projected for 9 years. She sat down across from me without making eye contact and folded her hands on the table. Gary Pruitt opened with a revised offer, $75,000, framed as a generous good faith gesture reflecting genuine value while avoiding costly protracted litigation. Renata let the silence stretch for a full 5 seconds before responding. A technique she'd told me beforehand was designed specifically to make the other side fill the void with concessions. You're offering 35% of documented replacement value, Renata said, for trees your client's son sold for cash within 24 hours of an unauthorized removal, using a fabricated policy your client backdated to justify it. I'd like to walk through the county prosecutor's referral before we discuss numbers any further, if that's all right. Debbie's composure cracked for the first time visibly in front of me. Not dramatically, just a tightening around her eyes, a stillness that hadn't been there a moment before. That referral is baseless, she said, voice steady but slightly too fast.
Those were board-approved decisions made.
Renata slid a single page across the table. The mill invoice, $41,600. T. Kessler Landscaping LLC. This invoice lists your son as the seller. Personally, not the HOA, she said. If this was a board-approved community safety action, why did the proceeds go to a private family business? The room went quiet. Invoice. Scanning it as though seeing it fully for the first time, which, based on his expression, he might genuinely have been. He glanced at Debbie. She was staring at the invoice like it had appeared out of thin air. There were operational costs, Debbie finally said. Tyler's company was compensated for services rendered. Standard subcontractor practice. Renata nodded slowly, then slid a second page across the table. Frank's sworn statement, specifically the sentence referencing moving the walnut situation before Q4 numbers close, tied to Kessler Reclaim's inventory needs. I watched something shift in Debbie's face at that moment. The particular look of someone realizing a person they trusted, someone they assumed had stayed loyal through fear alone, had actually turned against them with documentation. Frank, she said quietly, almost to herself, before catching herself and going silent again. Gary Pruitt requested a private recess to confer with his client. Renata agreed. For 18 minutes. Through the closed door, though none of us could make out words clearly, the tone of Debbie's voice rising and falling was unmistakable. She was not, seemed, having a calm conversation. When they returned, Gary Pruitt's demeanor had changed entirely, the practiced confidence of earlier replaced by careful, lawyerly caution. My client would like to explore a comprehensive resolution, he said, that addresses the property claim, the lien, and any other outstanding matters. in exchange for confidentiality regarding certain details of this meeting. Renata's answer was immediate and unambiguous. The invoice is admissible evidence in an active police referral. The affidavits from other affected families exist independently of this meeting. And a news segment covering this exact pattern airs Monday regardless of what we agree to today. Confidentiality isn't something I can offer you, even if I wanted to. Debbie's face, at that sentence, lost whatever composure remained. A news segment? She said, sharper now, the volunteer board member calm entirely gone. About what, exactly? I answered that question myself. The first time I'd spoken directly to her in the entire meeting. About you, Debbie. About all 4 families. About Carla's Maples too. Carla's name landed harder than I expected it would. Debbie's eyes flicked toward me. Something unreadable moving across her face. Not quite fear. Not quite anger. Something closer to the specific dread of watching a carefully built structure realize its foundation had cracks running through every load-bearing wall at once. Gary Pruitt requested a second recess. Renata declined this time. We've been generous with time today, she said. My client has spent 5 months documenting this, appraising this, and grieving this. I think it's reasonable to ask for a direct answer to a direct settlement number within this meeting, not another private conference. What followed was the longest silence of the entire 5-month ordeal. Debbie stared at the table. Gary Pruitt stared at his legal pad. I stared at Debbie, waiting, the way I imagine my father might have waited, patient and unhurried. The way old trees wait through decades for exactly this kind of reckoning. 214,000, Debbie finally said, not quite meeting my eyes, plus removal of the lien, plus a written correction to the HOA's records. I want it in writing that this ends here. Renata didn't smile, didn't gloat, simply nodded once and began pulling settlement paperwork from her folder that she'd, I realized, already prepared in advance. There's one more condition, Renata added, sliding a final document across the table. Immediate resignation from the HOA board, effective this week, with the reason documented in the resignation letter itself. Not vaguely framed as personal reasons. The homeowners of Cedar Hollow deserve to know exactly why their president is stepping down. Debbie looked up at that, and for a moment I thought she might refuse, might dig in the way I'd watched her dig in for 5 straight months over far smaller stakes. But something in her had finally run out, some reserve of certainty that had carried her through 9 years of unchallenged authority. She nodded. She signed the settlement that afternoon. $214,000. Paid from her personal assets since the HOA's insurance had already denied coverage. The fraudulent lien vacated immediately. A written record correction acknowledging unauthorized removal. And a resignation letter citing, in her own signed words, unauthorized property damage and misuse of association authority. I didn't feel triumphant walking out of that office. I felt something quieter, heavier, closer to relief than victory. Sarah met me in the parking lot, and I told her the number, the resignation, all of it. She hugged me for a long time before saying, now the trees actually get to mean something again. Josephine's segment aired Monday as scheduled, now including the settlement as a coda, along with statements from Carla and one of the other affected families whose case, emboldened by our outcome, they'd finally decided to pursue formally as well. The segment title, somewhat to my embarrassment, was "The HOA President Who Sold the Neighborhood's Trees." Frank was interviewed too. On camera this time, no longer hiding behind a manila folder in a diner booth. He spoke plainly about the culture of fear Debbie had built over 9 years. How easy it had been to look away from small cruelties until someone finally refused to look away from a big one. The county prosecutor's office, citing the settlement, the mill invoice, and Frank's sworn statement, ultimately declined to pursue felony theft charges against Debbie personally, given the civil resolution, but did file misdemeanor charges against Tyler Kessler for operating without a required county tree removal permit. He paid a fine and lost his contractor's license for 18 months. Kessler Reclaim's website disappeared within a month of the news segment airing. Its heritage American hardwood, sustainably reclaimed, listings scrubbed before any customer could formally connect their purchase to a residential clearcut. I doubt every customer who'd unknowingly bought a piece of someone's stolen backyard ever fully learned the truth. Some things stay buried. Debbie moved out of Cedar Hollow by early spring. Her white Lexus and its homemade President placard gone from the clubhouse lot for good. The house sold quickly to a young family who, Priya told me later with a laugh, had no idea about any of the history attached to the neighborhood they just joined. The HOA board, reorganized after Debbie's resignation with Frank as interim president, voted unanimously, an actual documented vote this time, to formally amend the covenants, restoring full legal protection for legacy landscaping and trees older than the association itself, closing the exact loophole Debbie had spent years quietly, and then not so quietly, exploiting. But settling the case didn't undo what had actually happened. And I want to be honest about that, because the Leo Tang before this ending wasn't clean or simple. It was ugly, and Debbie's worst behavior came not before the police report, but immediately after, when she realized documentation was closing in on her. In early December, before the settlement conference, before Frank came forward publicly, Debbie tried one more move I haven't mentioned yet, because it deserves its own telling. She attempted to have Emma's school contacted, anonymously, alleging concerns about the family's stability, a transparent, desperate attempt at retaliation aimed at the one thing I couldn't professionally armor myself against. The school counselor, thankfully experienced and unflappable, called Sarah directly rather than acting on an anonymous tip, describing the call as vague, oddly specific about our address, and clearly not coming from anyone with genuine knowledge of Emma's well-being. Sarah and I sat in the counselor's office that afternoon, furious in a way neither of us had been through the entire ordeal. Renata added this incident, once traced back through phone records subpoenaed during discovery to a burner number purchased at a gas station 2 miles from Debbie's house, timestamped 4 minutes after our formal invoice was delivered, as a formal exhibit. It became, arguably, the single most damaging piece of evidence in the entire case. Proof of retaliation, not just negligence. That's the piece I haven't told anyone outside Renata's office and Sarah. Until now. Debbie didn't just cut down 30 years of my father's trees for profit. When she felt cornered, she reached, briefly, toward my daughter, a line I don't think she fully understood she'd crossed until much later, if she ever understood it at all. I confronted her about it directly, once, during a heated exchange outside the clubhouse in mid-December, before the settlement conference. She denied it flatly, called the accusation desperate and unhinged, and threatened to have me removed from HOA property for harassment, an almost comical reversal given everything already documented against her by that point. Frank later confirmed, in his sworn statement, that Debbie had mentioned to him, in a moment of unguarded panic after our invoice arrived, wanting to find some leverage, something personal, before this gets out of hand. Frank said he'd assumed she meant something about property records, not our daughter's school. He regretted not asking more. I share this not to dwell on cruelty for its own sake, but because it matters to understanding who Debbie actually was underneath 9 years of blazers and clipboards and homemade presidential placards. This wasn't a rigid rule follower who occasionally overstepped. This was someone willing to escalate toward a child when a spreadsheet stopped working in her favor. The burner phone evidence, once uncovered, changed Renata's entire settlement strategy. What had been a property damages case became, functionally, a case with an implicit threat of criminal retaliation charges hanging over it too, which explained, in hindsight, why Gary Pruitt folded so quickly once we mentioned Monday's air date in that conference room. I never told Debbie, in that final meeting, that we knew about the school call. Renata advised against it, strategically, wanting to preserve it as leverage rather than reveal our full hand prematurely. It sat there in Renata's folder, unspoken, the entire time Debbie signed away $214,000 believing she'd already survived the worst of it. She hadn't survived the worst of it. She'd simply never learned the full shape of what she was actually up against, which, looking back, feels like the most fitting consequence of all. A woman who built 9 years of power on knowing everyone else's business finally lost everything to people who quietly learned all of hers. Tyler Kessler, for his part, tried once more after the settlement to salvage something, reaching out to Renata's office directly, unprompted, offering to cooperate fully in exchange for the misdemeanor charge being dropped. Renata forwarded the message to the prosecutor without comment. The charge stood. Hours at, of all places, a county tree nursery. I think about that irony sometimes. Tyler spending Saturday mornings planting saplings as court-mandated penance. Saplings that will take 30, 40, 60 years to become anything close to what my father's walnuts were the day they were felled. Some debts, I've learned, can be paid in dollars. Others take decades and belong to people who'll never see the payment made. By late spring, new trees stood in our backyard. 6 young walnuts and 2 young oaks, planted the same weekend Emma turned 11. A small ceremony, really, just the 3 of us. Shovels, root balls, and a rope swing Sarah insisted on hanging from the sturdiest young branch, even though it wouldn't hold real weight for years. Emma asked, planting the smallest walnut sapling herself, hands in the dirt, whether these trees would grow as big as the old ones someday. I told her the truth, the same truth my father probably would have told me. Not in our lifetime, maybe, but someday, for someone. That's the whole point of planting anything. Frank stayed on as HOA president for a full term afterward, and under his leadership, Cedar Hollow's board began publishing every vote, every meeting minute, and every architectural decision, publicly online within 48 hours. A transparency policy the previous board would have found almost unimaginable, and one several neighboring HOAs later adopted after hearing our story. I still keep the folder. The original one Sarah joked about back in August. Now 3 inches thick. Faded certified mail receipts. Appraisal reports. The mill invoice. Frank's statement. Everything. I don't look at it often anymore. But I keep it. The way you keep proof that something impossible to believe actually, truly happened, and was survived. The stumps are gone now too. Ground down and replaced with soil the same spring we planted the new trees. Sometimes, standing out there in the evenings, I still find the old rope swing scar in my memory before I remember it isn't physically there anymore. A phantom limb of a childhood landscape that outlived its own roots. Debbie Kessler, as far as anyone in Cedar Hollow knows, moved 3 counties away, started fresh somewhere nobody had heard her name yet. I don't know if she found a new community to control, a new clipboard to carry, a new 9 years to build on other people's silence. I hope, genuinely, that she didn't get the chance. What I learned, in the end, wasn't really about trees, or HOAs, or even about Debbie specifically. It was about the specific danger of reasonable people assuming reasonable behavior will always be met in kind, and the specific power of finally, carefully, documenting every unreasonable thing until the paper trail speaks louder than anyone's authority ever could. My father used to say a tree doesn't fight the wind. It just grows roots deep enough that the wind can't matter. I didn't understand what he meant until I watched 30 years of his patience get erased in 9 hours by someone who mistook stillness for weakness. He was never talking about actual trees. He was talking about this. Emma still asks, sometimes, why the new trees are so small compared to the photos of the old backyard. I tell her they're not small. They're just starting. The same way everything worth having eventually is. She usually rolls her eyes at that, the exact way I probably rolled my eyes at my own father once. The county, following the news coverage, quietly tightened its tree removal permitting requirements for HOA-adjacent properties, closing a gap that had allowed contractors like Tyler's to operate on flimsy authorization for years. It wasn't named after our case publicly, but Renata told me privately that our file sat open on a legislative aid's desk for months. Carla's case settled 2 months after mine, for a smaller amount reflecting her maple's lesser timber value, but with the same core terms: full appraisal payment, lien removal where applicable, and a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. She sent me a photograph afterward of a single sugar maple sapling planted in her new backyard, 3 counties over. I never did get a real apology from Debbie. Not in that conference room. Not afterward. Not ever. Renata told me early on not to expect one. That people who spend 9 years believing the rules exist for everyone but themselves rarely develop the capacity for genuine remorse just because they finally got caught. She was right. What I got instead was something better. In its own strange way, proof. Proof that my father's trees mattered, documented in an appraiser's careful language. Proof that the fear Debbie built her power on could be dismantled, piece by piece, by ordinary people simply refusing to stop asking for receipts. That felt like its own kind of justice. Sarah framed one document from the whole ordeal and hung it in our hallway. Not the settlement, not the invoice, but the appraiser's original report describing the 13 trees, their species, their ages, their history. This is the only part that was ever really true, she said.
Everything else was just proving it.
I think about Frank often. The quiet board member who spent years watching Debbie's pattern repeat before finally deciding my family's loss was the one he couldn't rationalize away anymore. I've never fully forgiven the years of silence before that, but I've come to understand it differently now, as the ordinary cowardice most of us carry until something forces us not to. The rope swing on our new young oak still doesn't hold much weight. 3 years too early for that, but Emma sits on it anyway most evenings, feet dragging in the grass. The same posture I remember from photographs of myself at her age. Sitting on a swing my father hung from a tree that no longer exists. Some evenings I still walk the property line where the drainage easement runs. The one Debbie invented a fake root hazard claim about. And think about how a lie built to justify greed ended up, eventually, forcing the truth about 9 years of quiet cruelty into the open for an entire neighborhood, and a few others, to finally see clearly. I don't know what happened to the actual lumber, the specific boards cut from my father's walnut trunks, whether they became someone's dining table, someone's kitchen cabinets, someone's heirloom furniture sold under a name that erased where it truly came from. Some questions, I've decided, don't need answers. Some losses just need to be witnessed and remembered honestly. Cedar Hollow feels different now. Lighter somehow. The way a room feels different once you realize the person who'd made everyone quietly anxious for years is simply gone. Neighbors talk more openly at the mailbox. Someone painted their shed a color that technically violates an old covenant nobody's bothered enforcing since Debbie left. And nobody minds at all. I ran into Priya at the grocery store last month, and she thanked me, unprompted, for what she called finally making it safe to ask questions around here. I told her it wasn't really me. It was Frank's courage, and Carla's willingness to go public first, and an appraiser who told me a hard truth I needed to hear. That's the part one keep coming back to. Honestly, none of this happened because I was especially brave or especially clever. It happened because enough ordinary people, at different moments, each decided to stop staying quiet. And those decisions, stacked one on top of another, built something Debbie's 9 years of control could never have survived intact. My father never met Debbie Kessler, died 4 years before she became HOA president. Never knew the trees he planted would someday become the center of a fraud investigation. A news segment, a settlement, a small quiet reckoning for an entire neighborhood's worth of fear. I think, in some strange way, he'd have found it darkly funny. He always said those walnuts would be worth something someday. Meant it as a joke about grandchildren's college funds. Never imagined it would become literally true in a courtroom sense. Appraised, itemized, invoiced. I like to think he'd have appreciated the specific irony of his patient, unglamorous planting becoming the thing that finally exposed something rotten. Sarah asked me recently if I'd do anything differently, knowing everything I know now. I told her the only thing I'd change is trusting Renata's instincts sooner, hiring her the moment the first letter arrived instead of months later. Everything else, the folder, the invoice, the patience, I think I'd do exactly the same way again. Emma doesn't fully understand yet what those 13 stumps represented. Not really, not the way Sarah and I do. To her, mostly, it's just the story of the summer the backyard got sunny and sad, then eventually got trees again. Someday, I imagine, I'll tell her the fuller version, the invoice, the lawyer, the burner phone. For now, I've told her the simpler version, the one that matters most at 10 years old. Someone did something wrong to our family. We didn't stay quiet about it. And eventually, because we kept asking questions and kept our proof organized, things got made right. I think that's actually the truest version anyway. I kept one small piece of the original walnut. A cross-section slabbed Dolores's husband, a hobbyist woodworker, salvaged from a fallen limb weeks before the removal. Unrelated to any of this, just sitting in his garage. He gave it to me after the settlement. Sanded and finished. Growth rings visible. 62 years counted clearly across its face. It sits on my desk now. That slab. A small round window into 30 years of my father's patience and one autumn of someone else's greed. Sometimes, during long workdays, I run my thumb across its rings without really thinking about it, the way you'd touch something for reassurance rather than purpose. It reminds me, mostly, that things regrow. Cedar Hollow's new covenants, the ones Frank's board passed unanimously, now require any tree removal above a certain trunk diameter to include a public 30-day notice period, an independent arborist assessment, and a recorded board vote with named signatures, not executive session shorthand. Small procedural changes, maybe, but built directly from exactly what broke in our case. Renata told me once, near the end of everything, that most cases like mine never reach this kind of resolution, that most families facing an HOA like Debbie's simply exhaust themselves, financially and emotionally long before discovery even finishes, and quietly move away instead, the way Carla nearly did, the way the Hendersons and 2 other families actually did. What made the difference in my case, she said, wasn't luck exactly, though the mill invoice surfacing was genuinely lucky. It was persistence paired with documentation, refusing to let a single letter, a single fine, a single dismissive phone call go unrecorded. You built the case Debbie assumed nobody ever would, she told me. That's the whole story. Really. I think about that phrase often. The case nobody assumed I would build. Debbie's entire 9-year system depended on that assumption. That documenting, praising, and formally pursuing accountability was too exhausting, too expensive, too socially costly for ordinary homeowners to bother with. For 4 families before mine, that assumption held. For mine, finally, didn't. The new saplings in our backyard won't reach anything close to their predecessor's size in my lifetime. And I've made peace with that in a way I couldn't have back when the stumps were still raw and pale in the November grass. My father planted trees he'd never see mature either. Some things you grow for other people entirely. Emma, now 11, has started asking to help water the new trees every evening. An unprompted ritual she's taken seriously since spring. Small watering can. Careful steps around each sapling's base. Sarah says she's building her own version of what my father built. 30 years early, without fully realizing it. I think Sarah might be exactly right about that. Late last month, an envelope arrived, forwarded through Renata's office. No return address beyond a P.O. box in a town 3 counties away. Inside, a single folded page. No signature. Containing 4 words in handwriting I recognized instantly from 9 years of certified letters and clipboard notations. I hope they're growing. I still don't know what to make of it. Renata advised against reading too much into it. Said closure rarely arrives in tidy, symbolic packages. That unsigned notes from people who caused real harm usually say more about their own unfinished reckoning than about any genuine remorse extended toward the people they harmed. I think she's probably right. I kept the note anyway. I didn't write back. Enough to say that hadn't already been said through appraisers, invoices, sworn statements, and a settlement check that cleared my bank account on a cold January afternoon. Some conversations end not with reconciliation, but simply with silence finally landing on the correct side of a very long ledger. What stays with me most, more than the number, more than the resignation letter, more even than the burner phone evidence, is a much smaller memory, Emma, the weekend we planted the new saplings, patting down the soil around the smallest walnut and asking, completely earnestly, will this one remember what happened to the old ones? I told her no. Trees don't remember, not the way people do. But I remember. Frank remembers, differently, with the particular weight of someone who stayed silent too long before finally speaking. Carla remembers, who salvaged that walnut slab without knowing its future significance. Remembers something of what that autumn actually cost our neighborhood. Memory, turns out, was the thing Debbie's entire system depended on erasing, quickly, efficiently, one flatbed truck and one cash sale at a time, before anyone could slow down enough to document what had actually been lost. Refusing to forget, refusing to let the paperwork disappear into a shredder, turned out to be the only weapon that mattered. Cedar Hollow held its first fully transparent annual meeting last month under Frank's leadership. Open minutes, recorded votes, a public comment period that actually functioned as one instead of theater before predetermined outcomes. I attended, sat in the back, said nothing, just watched an HOA meeting function the way I imagine it always should have. Afterward, a new homeowner, someone who'd moved in only 8 months earlier and knew almost nothing of the history, asked me casually why the backyard trees along my property line looked so young compared to everything else in the neighborhood. I told her it was a long story. Then, for the first time to a stranger, actually told it. She listened quietly through the whole thing. Appraisal figures and fabricated policies and burner phones and all, then said something that stuck with me for days afterward. That's the kind of story that makes a place safer. Once people finally hear it. I think that's true. I think that might be the actual point of telling it at all. My father's walnuts are gone. Sold for cash to a mill 2 counties over. Turned into someone's furniture under a name that hid where they truly came from. I'll never get those specific 30 years back. No settlement check, however large, actually restores that. But something else grew in their place. Slower, different, maybe even sturdier for having been tested. Trust. Mostly. Trust that documentation matters. Trust that quiet neighbors, given enough evidence and enough courage, will eventually stop staying quiet. Trust that a community built on 9 years of fear can, with effort, rebuild itself into something closer to what an HOA is supposed to be in the first place. A group of neighbors actually looking out for each other. I still walk out to the new saplings some evenings, the way I used to walk out to the old walnuts, checking on them without really needing to. the specific unglamorous patience of ownership and love. 60 years from now, someone I'll never meet might sit under their full canopy the way I once sat under my father's. That's the thought I hold on to most these days, more than the invoice, more than the settlement, more than Debbie's blazer and clipboard and homemade presidential placard fading from memory a little more each year. Somewhere down the road, decades from now, shade will fall across this yard again, planted by people who refused to let greed have the final word. Emma turned 12 this spring, tall enough now that the rope swing finally holds her weight properly. The young oak having grown just enough, just in time, the way things sometimes quietly do if you're patient and paying attention. She swings out over the grass most evenings, laughing, 12 years old and mostly unaware of everything it took to get her here. I watch her sometimes from the kitchen window, Sarah beside me, neither of us saying much, just watching a child swing under a tree that shouldn't technically be strong enough yet, but somehow, stubbornly, patiently, is. My father used to say roots find a way, given enough time and enough reason. I believe him more now than ever. Frank retired from the HOA board last fall, 3 years after Debbie's resignation, having rebuilt the association into something genuinely functional, transparent, and, according to nearly everyone in Cedar Hollow, almost boringly ordinary now. No scandals, no fabricated policies, no clipboards measuring grass height with the precision of a courtroom exhibit. Boring, turns out, is exactly what a good HOA should be. Carla and I still exchange occasional messages. Photographs mostly. Her sugar maple sapling now nearly as tall as her fence line. Mine and Emma's walnuts thickening at the base. Both of us quietly tracking the slow recovery of something that was taken from us too fast to properly grieve at the time it happened. I never did learn exactly what became of the actual boards cut from my father's trunks. Never tracked down whatever dining table or cabinet or heirloom shelf they eventually became under someone else's name. Renata told me, gently, that some losses simply don't come with full closure. That the appraisal check was never meant to replace what was actually lost, only to acknowledge it. I've made my peace with that incompleteness. Mostly. Some nights it still bothers me, standing out by the new saplings, wondering which house somewhere holds a piece of my father's patience disguised as reclaimed farmhouse furniture. Most nights, though, I think about the 6 young walnuts and 2 young oaks instead, and that feels like enough. Debbie Kessler's name still surfaces occasionally, usually when a new homeowner asks about the young trees, or when Frank references the old system during board meetings as a cautionary example rather than a name spoken directly. 9 years of unchallenged authority, in the end, got reduced to a hushed cautionary phrase in an HOA meeting nobody dreads attending anymore. That, more than anything, feels like the truest ending this story could have. Not dramatic, not vengeful, just quiet and ordinary, the way real justice often actually looks once the news cameras leave and the settlement checks clear and the lawyers move on to their next case. A neighborhood, slowly, carefully, learning to trust itself again. My father's trees are gone. That fact doesn't change, no matter how the rest of the story resolved. But new ones are growing, watered every evening by an 11-year-old who has started asking, unprompted, whether she can plant one more this spring. Just in case, she says. Trees like company. I told her that sounded exactly right. We planted 2 more walnuts that following weekend. Emma choosing the spots herself. Careful and deliberate the way her grandfather once was. Though she never met him. Though she only knows him through photographs and stories, and one small cross-section slab of walnut sitting on my desk. 62 rings counted clearly across its polished face. Someday, I imagine, Emma will tell this story to someone of her own. The summer the backyard went sunny and sad. Then slowly, patiently, became something whole again. I hope, by then, the details about invoices and burner phones and fabricated policies will have faded into something simpler. A story about trees, and about refusing to let them be forgotten. For now, though, the full story stays exactly as it happened, documented carefully in a folder 3 inches thick. A settlement check long since cleared. A resignation letter with Debbie's own signed admission of wrongdoing. A walnut slab on my desk. And a backyard slowly, stubbornly, filling back in with shade. One patient season at a time. People sometimes ask me, hearing the story secondhand through Josephine's segment or through neighborhood retellings that have grown slightly with each passing year, whether I feel like I won. I usually tell them the same thing Sarah told me in that backyard back in November, standing over 13 raw stumps in the cold. The trees don't come back. Never undid 30 years of my father's patience. Never undid the specific grief of finding a treehouse ladder nailed to a stump that led nowhere. What I got instead was something smaller and, in its own way, more lasting, proof, accountability, and a neighborhood that finally stopped being afraid. The morning after the settlement conference. Before any of it became public. Before Josephine's segment aired. Before Frank's resignation announcement. I woke early and walked out to the stumps one last time. Just to sit with them. The way you'd sit with something before finally letting it go completely. I brought coffee. Sat on the largest stump. The one Tyler's crew had left slightly higher than the others. And thought about my father. About the year I was born. About 30 years of patient, unglamorous growth reduced to numbers on a settlement document. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like finally being allowed to properly grieve something. Sarah joined me eventually. No words at first. Just her hand on my shoulder. Both of us watching frost melt slowly off 13 stumps in the early light. We're going to plant something better, she finally said. Not instead of grieving this, but alongside it. I've held on to that sentence longer than almost anything else from that entire ordeal. That afternoon, we called a local nursery, the same one, coincidentally, where Tyler Kessler would later serve his court-mandated community service hours, and ordered the first 6 walnut saplings, delivery scheduled for early spring, once the ground thawed enough for planting. Felt, at the time, like a small, quiet act of defiance against everything that had happened. It was only later, once the news segment aired, once Debbie's resignation became public, once the fraudulent lien vacated and Frank stepped into leadership, that the full scale of what our small backyard decision had actually set in motion became clear. 4 families' worth of quiet, accumulated harm, finally, all at once, brought into daylight. The board meeting where Frank formally announced Debbie's resignation, 2 weeks after the settlement, drew the largest homeowner turnout Cedar Hollow's clubhouse had seen in association memory. Folding chairs pulled from storage, people standing along the back wall. An entire neighborhood finally showing up because something real, finally, was actually happening in that room. Frank read the resignation letter aloud. Debbie's own words. Unauthorized property damage and misuse of association authority. And the room went silent in a way I'd never heard. A room go silent before. Not shocked exactly. More like a held breath finally being released after 9 years of holding it without realizing how long they'd been holding it. Someone in the back row. An older homeowner named Mr. Ostrowski, who'd lived in Cedar Hollow since before the association even incorporated, said quietly, just loud enough to carry, "Well, I'll be damned." And the tension in the room broke into something between laughter and disbelief. An entire neighborhood processing 9 years of accumulated fear all at once. Priya found me afterward in the parking lot. Tears in her eyes. Apologizing for something I told her she never needed to apologize for. The warning she'd given me back in my first weeks in the neighborhood. The Henderson story. All of it. "I should have said more," she said. "I should have helped you sooner." I told her she'd said exactly enough. Carla drove in from 3 counties over for that meeting, wanting to see Debbie's resignation announced in person, though Debbie herself hadn't attended, sending only a brief written statement through Gary Pruitt declining to comment further. Carla stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, and told me afterward it was the first time in 2 years she'd felt fully believed. Dolores, whose doorbell camera footage had unknowingly captured the original crew's arrival that October morning, brought her husband's walnut slab gift up in conversation. For the first time publicly that night, explaining to a small cluster of curious neighbors exactly why she'd salvaged that fallen limb months before any of this even started. Small, unrelated kindness, turned out, mattered enormously in hindsight. The following week, Josephine's segment aired as scheduled, running 12 minutes on the regional evening news, opening with drone footage of my backyard's raw stumps against November frost, closing with footage of the 6 new saplings freshly planted that spring. A visual arc she'd clearly designed deliberately to mirror the story's actual emotional shape. Comments and messages poured in afterward, mostly from strangers, some from other HOA disputes entirely unrelated to trees, sharing their own stories of retroactively fabricated policies, mysteriously vanished meeting minutes, and neighbors too afraid to speak up first. Renata told me her office received 4 new client inquiries directly citing our segment within the following month alone. One message stood out among the rest. From a woman 2 states away describing an HOA president who'd similarly authorized unauthorized removal of a protected oak grove, citing our case specifically as the reason she'd finally decided to hire a lawyer and request formal records instead of quietly complying. "You made this feel possible," she wrote. I read that message more than once. Renata forwarded me a follow-up note from the county prosecutor's office as well, informal but appreciated, noting that our case, combined with Carla's and the broader pattern documentation, had contributed directly to the county's decision to tighten tree removal permitting requirements for HOA-managed properties, closing the exact procedural gap Tyler's crew had originally exploited. I hadn't set out to change county policy. I set out, honestly, just to get an honest answer about a fabricated view corridor easement. But that's often how these things actually work. I've come to understand. Small honest questions, refused to be dropped, eventually accumulating into something with weight far beyond the original. Modest ask, Gary Pruitt, Debbie's attorney, reached out to Renata's office one final time months later. Not regarding our case, already fully closed, but requesting a professional reference, having apparently decided to shift his practice away from community association defense work entirely. Renata declined the reference politely, citing an obvious conflict of interest, and never heard from him again. Tyler Kessler completed his community service hours at the county tree nursery that same spring we planted our new saplings, an irony several neighbors pointed out to me more than once. Unprompted, clearly delighting in the specific poetic justice of it. I never ran into him there personally, though Dolores's husband apparently did, and said little was exchanged beyond a nod. I think about forgiveness sometimes, whether I've actually extended any toward Debbie or Tyler in the time since. And honestly, I don't think I have. Not fully, not in any way that feels meaningful to claim. What I've extended instead is something more like closure, the specific relief of a documented, acknowledged, formally resolved wrong, which isn't quite the same thing. Sarah says that's all right, that forgiveness was never actually required to move forward, that accountability and consequence can do most of the necessary work on their own, given enough time. I think she's probably right, though I still find myself, occasionally, standing near the new saplings, working through feelings I doubt will ever fully resolve into something simple. What resolved more cleanly, surprisingly, was my relationship with Cedar Hollow itself, the neighborhood I'd nearly convinced myself, during the worst months of the ordeal, to simply leave entirely, to sell the house, take the settlement, and start fresh somewhere Debbie's 9 years of shadow had never reached. Sarah talked me out of that more than once. This is still your father's land, she reminded me. Standing in the raw backyard back in December, stumps still fresh, snow starting to fall. Leaving doesn't undo what happened here. Staying and rebuilding it properly does something better. I didn't fully believe her in that moment. I believe her completely now, 3 years and 2 rounds of saplings later. Emma's 12th birthday party, held in that backyard this spring, drew nearly every family on our street. Kids running between 8 young trees still too small to provide real shade. Adults gathered near a grill Sarah insisted on setting up directly beside the walnut slab display table. A small, unplanned monument to everything the yard had survived. Mr. did too. Despite having no direct connection to our family beyond that one memorable board meeting outburst, bringing a small gift for Emma, a hand-carved wooden bird whittled, he told us proudly, from a piece of scrap oak salvaged decades earlier from his own property's original clearing. Wood, it seems, connects this neighborhood in ways nobody quite planned. Frank came too, no longer HOA president by then, just a neighbor again, the way he'd always wanted to be before 9 years of quiet complicity turned him into something else entirely. He stood by the new oak sapling for a long while that afternoon, and later told me it was the first time since Debbie's resignation he'd felt fully at peace with his own delayed courage. Carla couldn't make the party, 3 counties being too far for a Saturday afternoon, but she sent a photograph instead. Her sugar maple sapling now taller than her daughter. A small note attached, "Ours is growing too. Tell Emma happy birthday from a family she's never met, who owes yours more than we can properly say." I read that note aloud to Emma, who didn't fully understand its full weight yet. Being 12, being mostly focused on cake and friends and the particular joy of a birthday. Spent outdoors under trees that, however small still, were unmistakably hers. Planted with her own hands. Watered every evening without anyone needing to remind her. Someday she'll understand the full arc of it. I imagine the invoice, the burner phone, the settlement conference where a woman who once measured neighbors' grass with a ruler finally ran out of certainty and signed away $214,000 rather than face what documentation had built against her. For now, cake and sunshine felt like exactly the right kind of ending. That evening, after the party wound down, after the last guests left, Sarah and I sat on the back porch steps watching Emma and two friends attempt, unsuccessfully, to get the rope swing going properly on a tree still 2 years too young to fully support it. We didn't stop them. Before they're ready. Patiently, repeatedly, until they finally are. Your dad would have loved this, Sarah said quietly. Watching Emma laugh. Watching young branches sway under weight they weren't quite built for yet. I didn't say anything back. Just nodded. Thinking about a man who planted trees for grandchildren he never got to meet. Who somehow, impossibly, ended up shading this exact scene anyway. 30 years later, through roots that had to be replanted first. I think that's the truest thing this whole ordeal taught me. In the end, Debbie Kessler believed power meant never being questioned. Never having your authority examined closely enough to find the fabricated policy hidden underneath. She was wrong about that. Fundamentally, in a way 9 unchallenged years had simply never taught her to expect. Real power, turns out, looked much smaller than her clipboard and her homemade placard ever suggested. It looked like an appraiser's careful measurements. Like Frank's manila folder in a diner booth. Like Carla's willingness to speak first. Like a mill invoice nobody expected to surface. Like an 11-year-old, now 12, patiently watering saplings every single evening without being asked twice. The settlement money, most of it, went toward the new trees. A modest addition to Emma's college fund. Exactly the kind of purpose my father originally imagined those walnuts would someday serve. And a smaller portion, set aside deliberately, toward a legal fund Renata now maintains for homeowners facing similar HOA disputes who can't otherwise afford proper representation. Renata named it, without asking my permission first, the Delaney Fund. Something I only discovered when a woman from 2 counties overcalled my house directly last winter. Having been referred through it. Describing her own HOA's suspiciously specific new rule about detached garages that happened to match her property. And only her property. Exactly. I helped her the way Frank once helped me. Quietly. Over coffee. Walking through what documentation to request. What timelines to track. What silence from an HOA office actually means versus what it claims to mean. Felt strange. Briefly, being the experienced voice in that conversation instead of the frightened homeowner receiving a certified letter for the first time. Then it didn't feel strange at all. It felt like exactly what should happen next. The specific, ordinary continuation of everything Frank and Carla and Priya and Dolores had each contributed toward my own case, passed forward now toward someone else's. The way shade eventually reaches yards the original tree was never even planted for. My father's trees are gone. I've said that plainly throughout this whole account because it remains true. Unavoidably, no matter how thoroughly the rest of the story resolved itself into something resembling justice. 30 years of patient growth, reduced to stumps in 9 hours, sold for cash within a single day, is a loss no settlement fully repairs. But something else grew from that loss. Slower, wider than I expected, reaching neighbors 2 counties over, reaching a woman worried about her own garage, reaching Carla's daughter's sugar maple, reaching a county's revised permitting requirements, reaching an HOA board that now actually functions the way HOAs are supposed to function. Boringly, transparently, accountably. I don't know if my father would call that a fair trade. I don't think losses like this ever really resolve into something you'd call fair. Exactly. But I think he'd recognize the shape of it. Patient effort eventually outlasting someone else's shortcut. Roots eventually holding firmer ground than a rushed, greedy harvest ever could. He'd have understood that part completely. Debbie's white Lexus, I heard secondhand last year, was involved in a minor accident somewhere 3 counties over. Nothing serious, just a fender bender in a grocery store parking lot. The kind of small, unremarkable incident that means nothing except as a strange, distant reminder that her life, wherever it landed, simply continued on, ordinarily, invisibly, far from Cedar Hollow's memory of her. I felt nothing particular hearing that, no satisfaction, no lingering anger, just a mild, distant awareness that the woman who once measured our neighborhood's grass with a ruler was, somewhere, still just a person living an ordinary life. The specific ordinariness that 9 years of unchallenged power had convinced her, I think, she was somehow above having to live. That's perhaps the final, quietest twist this whole story turned out to hold. Not a dramatic downfall, not poetic destruction, just an ordinary woman, stripped of an artificial authority. She'd built on other people's silence, returned finally to the same ordinary scale everyone else in Cedar Hollow had been living at the entire time, whether she'd ever acknowledged it or not. I used to imagine, during the angriest months of this whole ordeal, some dramatic final confrontation, some moment where Debbie fully understood, fully felt, the weight of what she'd taken from my family. That moment never actually came. Not in the settlement conference. Not in the news segment. Not in any unsigned note mailed months later. What came instead, quieter and more lasting, was simply this 8 young trees, growing slowly in a backyard that used to be sunny and sad and is now, gradually, becoming something whole again. A neighborhood that stopped being afraid. A folder 3 inches thick. Proof that documentation, patience, and refusing to stay quiet can eventually outlast even 9 unchallenged years. The county prosecutor's office formally closed its file on the broader Cedar Hollow pattern last autumn, citing the civil settlements, Tyler's misdemeanor conviction, and the association's now thorough procedural reforms as sufficient resolution without pursuing additional charges against Debbie personally. A decision Renata described as the system working about as well as it realistically ever does. I've made peace with that outcome too. Mostly, understanding that civil accountability, however imperfect, however incomplete compared to what criminal consequences might have delivered, still managed to accomplish something real: restitution, public acknowledgement, structural reform, and for families, plus however many others contacted since. Finally freed from 9 years of quiet, accumulated fear. Frank's final act as HOA president, before stepping down last fall, was proposing a small plaque near the clubhouse entrance. A modest thing, easy to miss, listing the names of every family affected by the pattern he'd stayed silent about for too long, not as a monument to grievance, but as a permanent, quiet reminder for whoever leads Cedar Hollow next. I attended the small unveiling. No press, no drama, just a handful of neighbors gathered around a plaque smaller than a dinner plate. My family's name listed alongside Carla's, alongside the Hendersons, alongside 2 others I'd only learned about through Frank's own careful, belated research into a pattern he'd once been too afraid to fully investigate. Never again, the plaque reads simply, underneath the listed names. No further explanation offered. None really needed by anyone who'd lived through Cedar Hollow's last 9 years, or heard the story secondhand through Josephine's segment, or received a certified letter of their own citing a policy that, on close inspection, simply didn't exist yet. That plaque, more than the settlement check, more than Debbie's signed resignation letter, more than the mill invoice that started unraveling everything, feels like the truest, most permanent resolution this entire ordeal ever produced. A small, unglamorous, deliberately boring piece of neighborhood infrastructure, built specifically so nobody forgets how easily fear can masquerade as authority. I stood by it a long while that afternoon, Sarah beside me, Emma running ahead toward the new playground equipment the reorganized board had finally, transparently, properly voted to install, funded partly, fittingly, by unspent compliance fee reserves Debbie had quietly accumulated over 9 years for purposes nobody, turned out, had ever actually approved. Renata joined us for coffee afterward. Her first visit to Cedar Hollow since the settlement conference concluded years earlier. Walking the property line with me one final time. Past the plaque. Past the reorganized clubhouse. Out to the backyard where 8 young trees stood slightly taller than they had the previous spring. Patient. Ordinary. Unmistakably alive. You did something rare, she told me. Standing near the young walnuts. Hands in her coat pockets. Most people in your position get exhausted somewhere around the 4th certified letter and just give up. Move away. Absorb the loss quietly. You didn't. Mark. That's just refusing to let someone else's lie become the final version of events. I've thought about that sentence often since. The final version of events. And how close Debbie came to writing it entirely on her own terms. A fabricated policy. A quiet removal. A modest cash settlement offer designed to close the matter before anyone thought to ask harder questions. She nearly succeeded. For families before mine proved exactly how close. What stopped her, in the end, wasn't any single dramatic moment, but an accumulation of small, ordinary refusals. An arborist who told the truth about root safety. A mill manager who wouldn't touch untraceable timber. A board member who finally stopped rationalizing his own silence. A reporter who did her homework before ever making a call. And underneath all of it, quietly, persistently, my own refusal to simply accept the first explanation offered. The first fine paid. The first vague policy cited without evidence. Sarah says that stubbornness came from my father. The same patient, unglamorous stubbornness that spent 30 years growing walnut trees nobody was in any hurry to see mature. I think she's right about that. Mostly. I think, in the end, this entire story was never really about trees at all. Not fundamentally, though 13 of them had to fall before anyone thought to look closely enough to see the pattern underneath. It was about what happens when patient, ordinary people finally decide silence has cost them enough. Debbie Kessler built 9 years of unchallenged authority on exactly that silence, mistaking it for consent, mistaking it for weakness, never once accounting for the possibility that, somewhere along her carefully maintained system, someone patient enough, documented enough, and finally angry enough, might simply refuse to let the silence continue past a certain point. That point, for me, arrived somewhere between a fabricated view corridor policy and a flatbed truck disappearing down our street with 30 years of my father's patience loaded onto it. I didn't know, standing in that backyard at 1 in the morning counting 13 raw stumps, that I was about to spend the next 5 months building a case. I only knew, in that specific moment, that something precious and irreplaceable had been taken carelessly, cruelly, and profitably, by someone who assumed grief alone would be enough to keep me quiet the way it had kept 4 families quiet before mine. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about almost everything. Eventually, the 8 young trees in our backyard now stand as the clearest answer I know how to give to that miscalculation. Small, patient, growing slightly taller each season, tended every evening by a 12-year-old who has no memory of the old walnuts but has grown up, entirely, in the shadow of what it took to plant these new ones properly. Someday, decades from now, someone will sit under their full mature canopy the way I once sat under my father's, the way Emma now sits, feet dragging in the grass, on a rope swing hung from a tree still 2 seasons away from truly holding her weight. That someone may never know the full story behind why these trees exist at all. That's all right. I've decided. Not every tree needs its full history remembered by everyone who eventually enjoys its shade. Some things just need to exist. Patiently, ordinarily, proof that greed and fabricated authority eventually lose to documentation, persistence, and neighbors who finally decide 9 years of silence is 9 years too many. My father planted trees he never expected to see fully mature, patient in a way that always struck me, growing up, as slightly old-fashioned, slightly impractical, planting for grandchildren he might never meet rather than for any benefit he'd personally live to enjoy. I understand that patience completely now, in a way I never did before all of this happened. It's the same patience Frank finally found. 3 years too late but found nonetheless. The same patience Carla showed reaching out to a reporter rather than quietly moving away. The same patience an appraiser brought to measuring growth rings across 13 stumps in cold November grass. Careful, unhurried, refusing to let greed's speed outpace truth's slower, steadier arrival. I keep the walnut slab on my desk still, 62 rings visible across its polished face. A small, permanent reminder of exactly what patience actually looks like when you finally measure it properly. 30 years condensed into a circle I can hold in both hands. Proof that some things, however slowly, however quietly, really were worth growing after all. Cedar Hollow's board meetings now run, according to Frank's successor, in under 45 minutes most months. an almost unbelievable contrast to the hour-long performances Debbie once orchestrated. Executive sessions stretching indefinitely, votes taken and reported without ever quite happening in front of anyone who might actually ask an inconvenient question about them. I don't attend those meetings much anymore. Honestly, not because I don't care, but because they've become exactly what Frank always hoped they'd eventually be. Boring, procedural, unremarkable. The specific kind of boring that means a neighborhood is finally being governed the way it should have been governed all along, without fear organizing quietly underneath every decision. That boredom, I've come to understand, is its own quiet form of victory, maybe the truest one available in situations like this. Nobody in Cedar Hollow worries anymore about a certified letter citing a policy that didn't exist a month earlier. Nobody assumes silence protects them. Nobody measures their neighbor's grass with a ruler, waiting for an excuse. Emma will grow up in that ordinary, boring version of this neighborhood, mostly unaware of how deliberately, how expensively, how patiently it was rebuilt into something safe. I think that's exactly as it should be. Some fights exist specifically so the next generation never has to fight them again. So they simply get to enjoy the shade instead. Sarah says I've gotten quieter about the whole ordeal over these past few years. Less inclined to retell it at parties or bring it up unprompted the way I once did in those raw, angry months right after the settlement. She's right. Once fully told, once fully resolved, earn the right to finally rest. This is likely the last time I'll tell it in full, start to finish, invoice and burner phone and settlement conference and all. Not because it stopped maturing, but because the trees have started maturing more, growing steadily, ordinarily, exactly the way trees are supposed to grow when nobody's rushing to cut them down for profit anymore. 2 years after the settlement, the county officially adopted the permitting reforms Renata's office had quietly pushed for throughout the case, requiring independent arborist review and 30-day public notice before any HOA authorized tree removal above a certain trunk diameter countywide. A small procedural safeguard born directly from 13 stumps in my backyard. Renata's legal fund, the one bearing my family's name without my original permission, has since helped 11 other families across 3 counties navigate similar disputes. Most resolved quietly, a few requiring the same patient documentation Frank once handed me across a diner table. Folder by folder, evidence accumulating until silence finally lost its usefulness entirely. I still get occasional messages through that fund. Strangers describing fabricated policies, mysteriously vanished meeting minutes, contractors with suspiciously convenient placards zip-tied to their dashboards. Each message follows roughly the same shape mine once did. Disbelief, then anger, then, slowly, the specific determination required to start keeping a folder of their own. I answer every one personally, usually with the same advice Renata gave me at the very beginning, back when $214,000 was still an unimaginable number and 13 stumps were still raw enough to smell of fresh-cut wood. Document everything. Trust nothing verbal. Ask for the signatures. Ask, and keep asking, until someone finally answers honestly. That advice cost my family 5 months, a great deal of grief, and 30 years of my father's patient trees before it finally worked. But it worked. For the Hendersons eventually receiving a quiet apology of their own. For 11 families since. For a county's revised permitting code. For a neighborhood that finally stopped being afraid. It worked. Most of all, for 8 young trees now growing steadily in a backyard that once held 13 raw stumps under November frost, tended every evening by a girl who never met her great-grandfather but has, somehow, patiently, inherited exactly his particular kind of stubborn, hopeful, unglamorous care for things that take decades to properly grow. Someday those trees will provide real shade, real rope swing weight, real decades of quiet presence the way the old walnuts once did before greed and a fabricated policy erased them in 9 hours. Someday, someone will sit beneath them without knowing any of this story at all. And that, I finally decided, will be exactly the point. My father planted trees for people he'd never meet. I replanted them for the same reason. Patient, unglamorous, certain that somewhere down the line, the effort would matter to someone even if I never personally witnessed the fullest version of it. That's the whole inheritance. Really, roots and patience, passed forward, one careful season at a time. Cedar Hollow is quieter now, safer now. Its silence no longer built on fear but on something closer to trust. Ordinary and unremarkable in exactly the way a good neighborhood should be. 8 young trees stand where 13 old ones fell, growing slowly, patiently, toward a future none of us will fully see, but all of us, finally, helped plant honestly. The end.